I bought my wife a diamond ring for our 10th anniversary. 2.5 carats, $15,000, 3 months of searching for the perfect stone. She cried when I gave it to her. She wore it to the neighborhood fall festival, and that was when Victoria Evans first saw it. The HOA president stared at the ring like it belonged to her. She asked my wife to give it to her, for free, when Hannah said no. Victoria smiled and said she always gets what she wants. She had no idea what she had just started. This is how a spoiled Karen lost everything trying to steal a gift that was never hers. The diamond caught the candlelight and scattered it across the ceiling like a constellation being born. I had spent 3 months searching for that stone, visiting jewelers across Dallas and Austin, comparing certificates until my eyes burned. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because if you have ever had someone try to take something precious from you, this story will resonate. The ring was 2.5 carats, set in platinum with a band that matched Hannah's grandmother's wedding ring. $15,000. Every penny of my project bonus from the software company where I worked remotely. Hannah opened the velvet box at our anniversary dinner, and the tears came before the words. She slid it onto her finger and held her hand up to the light, watching the facets dance. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building something together. The ring was a symbol of that, a promise renewed. 1 week later, we attended the Meadowbrook Heights Fall Festival. The HOA organized these events quarterly, and Hannah enjoyed meeting neighbors in the community we had moved into 8 months earlier. She wore the ring proudly, and I watched her show it to friends near the refreshment table, her smile bright against the October afternoon. The community clubhouse lawn was decorated with hay bales and pumpkins, children running between games, the smell of apple cider and grilled corn drifting through the crowd. I was talking with a neighbor about property taxes when I noticed Hannah's posture change. Her shoulders tightened, her smile became fixed. Someone had approached her, and even from 20 feet away, I could tell the conversation had shifted into uncomfortable territory. The woman standing in front of Hannah was Victoria Evans, president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. I had seen her at 2 previous community events, always dressed impeccably, always surrounded by people who seemed to defer to her every word. She was 52 years old with professionally colored hair and jewelry that looked expensive but somehow never quite fit the occasion. Victoria held Hannah's hand, examining the ring with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for a casual introduction. She turned Hannah's hand toward the light, angled it, and studied the diamond the way a buyer might study merchandise. I saw Hannah try to pull her hand back gently. Victoria's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. Hannah's smile faltered, her eyes darting sideways in a silent plea for rescue that no one nearby seemed to notice. When Victoria finally released her, Hannah took a small step backward, her freed hand moving instinctively behind her back. I crossed the lawn and reached them as Victoria was finishing her sentence. The words I caught were enough to stop me mid-step. Victoria was saying that the ring would suit her style better, that it seemed too flashy for a school teacher, that Hannah should consider giving it to someone who could appreciate it properly. She delivered these words with a smile that never reached her eyes, her tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting what she asked for. Hannah laughed nervously and said the ring was a gift from me, that it was not available for giving. Victoria's smile did not waver. She patted Hannah's shoulder and said she understood that Hannah should think about it and come find her if she changed her mind. Then she walked away to greet another group, leaving Hannah standing with her hand unconsciously pressed against her chest, covering the ring. That night, after we returned home and Hannah had gone to bed early with a headache she blamed on the autumn wind, I stood at the kitchen window cleaning up the last of the dishes. The street outside was quiet, lit by the amber glow of decorative lampposts that the HOA maintained with meticulous attention. A movement caught my eye. Someone was standing on the sidewalk, directly in front of our house, not walking, not waiting for a dog, just standing and looking up at our windows. The figure was illuminated briefly when a car passed on the cross street, Victoria Evans. She stood there for nearly a minute, her gaze fixed on the second floor where our bedroom light had just gone off. Then she turned and walked back toward her house 3 streets away, her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded almost like counting. I did not mention it to Hannah that night. I did not want to worry her over what might have been nothing, but I pulled out my phone and opened a notes app, typing quickly before the details faded. Victoria Evans, 9:47 p.m. Standing in front of the house, looking at windows. I saved the note and set my phone on the counter. The ring sat on Hannah's nightstand upstairs, catching whatever light filtered through the curtains. A gift given freely, received with joy, now circled by something I could not yet name, but had learned in 38 years of living to recognize. The feeling that someone had decided something belonged to them, and that the current owner was merely an obstacle. 3 days after the festival. The doorbell rang at 2 in the afternoon. Hannah was home grading papers while I worked in my office upstairs, and I heard her footsteps crossing the living room, followed by the click of the front door opening. A voice I recognized immediately drifted up the stairwell. Victoria Evans had come to visit, carrying what she described as homemade cookies as a welcome gift for the new neighbors. I saved my work and walked quietly to the top of the stairs, listening. Victoria's tone was warm, almost maternal, the kind of voice people use when they want something but have not yet decided how hard to push for it. She complimented Hannah's taste in curtains. She asked about Hannah's teaching job. She mentioned how wonderful it was to have young couples bringing energy to Meadowbrook Heights. Then she asked about the ring. I descended the stairs slowly, making enough noise to announce my presence without seeming to rush. By the time I reached the living room, Victoria was standing uncomfortably close to Hannah, her fingers extended toward Hannah's hand in a gesture that was half request and half demand. Hannah had her arms crossed tightly against her chest, the ring pressed into the fabric of her sleeve, her body language a wall that Victoria was clearly trying to breach. When Victoria noticed me, she withdrew her hand smoothly and redirected her attention to the cookies on the coffee table, explaining that she used her grandmother's recipe and that everyone in the neighborhood loved them. I thanked her for the gesture and asked if there was anything else we could help her with. Victoria's smile remained fixed as she delivered what she clearly believed was a reasonable proposition. She said she had been thinking about the ring since the festival. She said it was truly beautiful, but perhaps too ostentatious for someone in Hannah's profession. Teachers, she explained, needed to project modesty and approachability, and a ring that large might create distance between Hannah and her students' families. She said she would be willing to take it off our hands for $2,000, a fair price that would allow Hannah to purchase something more appropriate while also giving the ring a home where it could be properly appreciated. Hannah's face went pale. She looked at me, then back at Victoria, her voice barely steady as she explained that the ring was an anniversary gift, that it held sentimental value beyond its price, that it was not for sale. Victoria nodded sympathetically, as if Hannah had simply failed to understand the logic of the offer. She said Hannah should think about it, that $2,000 could buy many practical things, and that the offer would remain open for now. After Victoria left, Hannah sat on the couch with her hands pressed together, the ring hidden between her palms. She asked me if she had done something wrong at the festival, if she had somehow given Victoria the impression that the ring was available. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her that some people interpreted kindness as weakness and politeness as permission. Hannah nodded, but did not look convinced. That night, she did not wear the ring to bed. She placed it in the small jewelry box on her dresser and closed the lid carefully, as if protecting it from something she could not name. The first violation notice arrived 48 hours after Hannah's refusal, timed with a precision that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The envelope contained a single page informing us that we had violated Section 4.7 by failing to store our trash receptacle within the designated time frame. The fine was $150. I checked my security camera footage. The timestamp showed the bin inside the garage at 7:15, 45 minutes before the deadline. When I called the HOA office, Brenda Collins informed me that President Evans had personally confirmed the violation and that the decision was final. No photographs, no documentation, just Victoria's word against my camera. I printed the footage and saved the notice to a new folder on my computer. 3 days later, Victoria's email arrived. Hannah called me into the kitchen where she sat staring at her laptop screen, her coffee growing cold beside her. The subject line read, "Thinking of you," and the message explained that Victoria had reconsidered her offer and was now willing to pay $3,000 for the ring. The final line read, "This is your last opportunity at this price." Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the message a second time. She asked me why this woman would not just leave us alone. She asked what we had done to deserve this kind of attention. I did not have an answer that would make her feel better, so I simply closed the laptop and told her not to respond. The next morning, a second violation notice appeared in our mailbox. This one accused us of exceeding the maximum grass height of 4 inches. The timing was surgical. Arriving less than 12 hours after Hannah ignored Victoria's email, I walked outside with a ruler and measured the lawn in 5 locations, photographing each reading. The tallest blade was 3.8 inches. I added the images to the folder, which was growing into something that looked less like documentation and more like evidence. The following Saturday, I cleared the dining table and spread out every document related to Victoria Evans and the HOA, violation notices, camera footage screenshots, email printouts. I had begun constructing in my notes app. Hannah watched from the kitchen doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, the ring notably absent from her finger for the 3rd consecutive day. She asked what I was doing. I told her I was organizing our defense, that people like Victoria operated on the assumption that their targets would eventually give up and comply, and that I intended to make compliance impossible by documenting every lie she told. Hannah nodded slowly, then walked over and sat beside me. She asked how she could help. I handed her a highlighter and pointed to the stack of HOA governing documents I had downloaded from the community website the night before. The CC&Rs for Meadowbrook Heights were 68 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions written in language designed to be intimidating rather than clear. We divided the document between us and began reading, but the legal terminology slowed our progress to a crawl. Section after section blurred together, cross-referencing other sections, defining terms in ways that seemed intentionally circular. By noon, we had covered barely 20 pages and found nothing useful. Hannah rubbed her eyes and asked if this was even worth the effort. I told her to take a break and keep going, that somewhere in these pages was the proof that Victoria had overstepped her authority. It took until early afternoon, nearly 4 hours of reading, before I finally found what I was looking for, buried in Sections 7 and 9. Section 7.3 stated that all violation notices must include photographic evidence documenting the alleged infraction. Section 7.5 guaranteed residents the right to appeal any violation within 14 days of receipt. Section 9.2 specified that fines could only be imposed following a majority vote of the HOA board. I read the passages aloud, and Hannah leaned over my shoulder to verify the words herself. Neither of our notices had included photographs. No one had informed us of our appeal rights. Victoria had issued both fines unilaterally. Hannah's hand found mine and squeezed, her grip carrying equal parts relief and renewed anger. She asked how Victoria could have gotten away with this for so long if the rules were this clear. I told her that rules only mattered when someone was willing to enforce them, and that most people never bothered to look. I consolidated all our documentation into a single, organized folder, then drafted a formal appeal letter citing each provision the HOA had violated. That evening, I walked to the mailbox and encountered James Holloway retrieving his own mail 3 houses down. James was a civil attorney in his mid-40s who had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 7 years, long enough to have observed Victoria's tenure from its beginning. We had exchanged pleasantries at previous community events, but this was the first time we had spoken at length. James asked how we were settling into the neighborhood, and something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I mentioned the violation notices. His expression shifted from neighborly politeness to knowing concern. He invited me to his porch for a beer and told me that I needed to hear some things about Victoria Evans before the situation escalated further. James spoke for nearly an hour as the sun set behind the houses across the street. He told me that Victoria had a pattern, one that he had watched repeat itself at least 4 times during her 6 years as HOA president. She would identify something she wanted from a resident, usually jewelry or valuable collectibles, and begin a campaign of pressure that started with suggestions and escalated through HOA violations until the target either surrendered the item or sold their home and moved away. The Thompson family 4 years ago had owned a pearl necklace that Victoria coveted. After 8 months of manufactured violations, they sold their house at a loss. Mr. Keating, a retired accountant 2 streets over, had given Victoria his vintage Rolex after 6 months of harassment simply to restore peace. James himself had spent 2 years fighting Victoria over a fence dispute, a claim eventually proven false, but not before costing him nearly $5,000. I asked why no one had stopped her. He said Victoria was careful, never putting anything incriminating in writing, always maintaining plausible deniability, targeting people who were new or isolated. Most victims found it easier to leave than to fight. I told James I was not most victims. He studied my face, then nodded and offered to help pro bono. The next morning, James introduced me to Gloria Mendez, a 67-year-old widow who had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 22 years. Gloria poured coffee and recounted stories that confirmed everything James had told me. She remembered every family Victoria had targeted, every valuable item that had changed hands under duress. She told me that Victoria's boutique had failed 3 years ago, and that she suspected Victoria was deeply in debt, using her position to acquire things she could no longer afford. Gloria retrieved a manila folder from her bedroom closet containing dates, names, incident descriptions, and contact information for former residents who might provide statements. I thanked her and promised her trust would not be wasted. That afternoon, I installed 3 additional security cameras and upgraded the doorbell unit to a model with better night vision. All feeds are now uploaded automatically to a cloud server beyond Victoria's reach. Hannah watched me work from the kitchen window, and when I came inside, she asked if we were really going to fight this. I told her we were. She asked what would happen if we lost. I took her hands and told her that losing meant letting someone take not just the ring, but our dignity, our peace, and our right to live without fear in our own home. Hannah looked at the ring sitting in its box on the counter. She picked it up slowly, turned it in the light, then slid it back onto her finger for the first time in days. She said that if we were going to fight, she was going to wear what was hers. The diamond caught the afternoon sun and scattered light across the kitchen wall. It looked like defiance made visible. My formal appeal letter was rejected within 72 hours. The response came not from the HOA board, but from Brenda Collins directly, a single paragraph stating that my appeal had been reviewed and denied without explanation. I had cited 3 specific sections of the CC&Rs that the HOA had violated. The rejection addressed none of them. I requested the minutes from the board meeting where my appeal had allegedly been reviewed, invoking Texas Property Code Section 209.005. 2 weeks later, the minutes arrived. I read them twice, searching for any reference to my appeal or the Gray family violations. There was nothing. No discussion, no vote, no mention of our name. James Holloway explained that when I showed him the document that Victoria had stacked the board years ago with allies who rubber-stamped her decisions without question. 2 members were personal friends from her boutique days. The third rarely attended meetings and signed whatever Brenda put in front of him. The board existed on paper, but functioned as Victoria's personal endorsement machine. I requested a meeting with the HOA to discuss the violations in person. Brenda responded that President Evans would meet with us privately at the HOA office the following Tuesday. Hannah did not want to attend. She said she could not sit across from that woman and pretend to have a civil conversation. I told her that I understood, but that I needed her there as a witness to whatever Victoria might say. Hannah agreed reluctantly. And on Tuesday afternoon, we walked into the small office at the back of the community clubhouse, where Victoria sat waiting behind a desk that was too large for the room. She wore a cream-colored blazer and a smile that suggested she had already won. I pressed record on the phone in my jacket pocket and sat down across from her. Victoria began by expressing her disappointment that we had chosen confrontation over cooperation. She said the violations were minor matters that could easily be resolved if we simply demonstrated a willingness to be good neighbors. I asked her to define what being a good neighbor meant. She paused, her smile flickering almost imperceptibly, then leaned forward and spoke in a tone that someone unfamiliar with her might have mistaken for sincerity. She said that Hannah's ring had become something of a topic in the community, that some residents felt it was inappropriate for a young couple to display such ostentatious wealth, and that it would be a gesture of goodwill for Hannah to donate the ring to the HOA's annual charity auction, where it could benefit the entire neighborhood. I watched Hannah's face as the words landed. Her eyes widened first, then narrowed. Her hands, which had been folded politely in her lap, curled into fists so tight her knuckles went white. She drew a breath as if to speak, but the sound that almost escaped was not words. It was something closer to a growl. I placed my hand on her arm and spoke first. I asked Victoria if she was suggesting that we give away personal property as a condition for having fraudulent violations dismissed. Victoria's smile tightened. She said she was merely offering a path toward community harmony, that the decision was entirely ours. I asked if things worked in Meadowbrook Heights by the HOA president, manufacturing violations to pressure residents into surrendering valuable items. Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment, something hard and cold surfacing behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. She said I was mischaracterizing her intentions. She said that if we chose to be difficult, there were many rules in the CC&Rs, and she could not guarantee that our property would always comply. I asked if that was a threat. She said it was advice and that we should think carefully before rejecting it. Hannah finally spoke, her voice low and steady in a way I had rarely heard. She told Victoria that the ring was hers, that it would stay hers, and that no amount of fake violations would change that. Victoria's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. 1 week after the meeting, our security cameras captured Victoria approaching our house at 11:23 in the morning. I learned later from Gloria that Victoria had seen both our cars leave that morning, Hannah for school and me for a doctor's appointment in the city. She had been watching. The footage showed Victoria walking up our driveway with the casual confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, someone who had done this before without consequence. She tried the front door handle, locked. She walked around the side of the house, briefly disappearing from one camera's view before appearing in another. She tried the back door, also locked. She cupped her hands against the kitchen window and peered inside, her gaze sweeping across the room. She stood in front of our garage for nearly 5 minutes, occasionally glancing at the street. When a neighbor's car drove past, she turned and walked back to the sidewalk, disappearing toward her own house. I watched the footage that evening, with my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of containing anger that threatened to overwhelm my judgment. Hannah stood behind me, her grip tightening on my shoulder as she watched Victoria try each door. She asked what we were supposed to do now, whether we should call the police. I told her we would do neither, not yet. I told her that Victoria had just committed criminal trespass on camera, and that this evidence would be far more valuable as part of a larger pattern than as the basis for a single complaint that her connections might help dismiss. Hannah asked how much more we were supposed to endure. I told her the fighting had already begun, but that winning required patience. 3 days later, a new violation notice arrived. The envelope contained not one accusation, but 6, covering infractions allegedly committed over the previous 3 weeks. Landscaping failures, improper equipment storage, unauthorized modifications, parking violation, noise complaint, failure to submit an architectural review for a backyard planter that had been there when we bought the house. The total fines exceeded $1,200, with a deadline of 30 days before the HOA would file a lien against our property. Hannah read the notice and set it down without speaking. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set in a line I had learned to recognize. She was not crying from sadness, she was crying with fury. She looked at the ring on her finger and said that Victoria wanted her to feel small. She said she refused to give her that satisfaction. The diamond caught the kitchen light, and for a moment, it looked less like jewelry and more like armor. The following Monday, I sat across from James Holloway in his home office with a folder containing every piece of evidence I had collected over the previous 4 weeks. Violation notices without photographic documentation, camera footage proving the violations were fabricated, the recording from the HOA office, where Victoria explicitly connected the dismissal of fines to surrendering Hannah's ring, the video of Victoria attempting to enter our home, board meeting minutes that contradicted Brenda's claim of a proper appeal review. James studied each item methodically, occasionally pausing to make notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and looked at me with an expression that combined professional assessment with something closer to admiration. He told me that I had assembled enough evidence to support multiple criminal charges and a substantial civil lawsuit. The recording constituted extortion under Texas law. The video was of criminal trespass. The fabricated violations represented fraud and abuse of fiduciary duty. The lien threat, if pursued based on false accusations, would constitute a fraudulent lien filing. James said that any competent prosecutor would be interested in this case. He asked how I wanted to proceed. I told him I wanted to file a police report immediately, but that I also wanted to give Victoria one more opportunity to incriminate herself publicly before we closed the trap. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. I intended to be there. 2 days later, I sat in Detective Amanda Reyes' office at the Dallas County Sheriff's Station. James had summarized the legal framework. Now, I walked Amanda through the human story behind it. The festival where Victoria first saw the ring. The escalating pressure, the moment I watched her try our doors on camera while Hannah and I were at work. Amanda listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes occasionally moving to the folder of supporting documents I had placed on her desk. When I finished, she told me that she had received complaints about Meadowbrook Heights before, but that no one had ever followed through with documentation this thorough. She said she would open a formal investigation, and that if I wanted to expose Victoria at the HOA meeting first, she could coordinate with the district attorney to have officers present afterward. Any arrest would require proper review and approval, but, given the strength of the evidence, she expected that process to move quickly. I thanked her and told her I would keep her informed of the timing. The next 3 days were consumed by preparation. I contacted the families whose information Gloria had provided, expecting resistance or reluctance from people who had already chosen to walk away from their fight with Victoria. Instead, I found something closer to relief. The Thompson family responded within 2 hours of my email, saying they had spent 4 years hoping someone would finally stand up. Mr. Keating answered his phone on the first ring and agreed immediately to speak publicly about being coerced into surrendering his father's Rolex. 3 families provided written statements describing their experiences. The speed of their responses made one thing clear: Victoria had created enemies who had been waiting for exactly this moment. On the Friday before the meeting, I received an email from Victoria. The subject line read, "Final Notice," and the message informed me that the HOA had filed a lien against our property for unpaid fines totaling $1,200. The email stated that we had 30 days to pay before foreclosure proceedings would begin. I forwarded the message to James, who confirmed within an hour that no lien had actually been filed with the county. Victoria was bluffing, attempting to frighten us into compliance before the meeting, where she clearly expected to maintain control. I did not respond to her email. Instead, I sent a message to the HOA secretary requesting time on the agenda under the resident comment period that the CC&Rs guaranteed. Tommy Reed called me that evening. He was the community security guard, a 28-year-old who had worked for the HOA for 3 years. His voice was nervous, hesitant, the voice of someone who had been arguing with himself for days and had finally reached a decision. He told me he had watched the video of Victoria trying our doors, that she had asked him to delete it from the community security system, that he had pretended to comply while keeping a copy because something about the request felt wrong. He said Victoria had instructed him to monitor our house and report on our movements, to document any violations he observed, even if he had to interpret the rules creatively to find them. He said he had followed her instructions at first because he needed the job, but that the weight of what he was being asked to do had become impossible to carry. I asked if he would be willing to testify about Victoria's instructions at the upcoming meeting. The line went silent for several seconds. Then Tommy said yes, that he was tired of being afraid. I thanked him and added his name to the list of witnesses. The trap was nearly complete. Victoria believed she was in control, that her position and connections protected her from consequences, that the Gray family would eventually surrender like every other target before us. She had no idea that the evidence against her had grown into something she could not dismiss. She had no idea that the community she had manipulated for 6 years was about to hear the truth from multiple voices with nothing to gain from lying. Hannah sat beside me on the couch as I reviewed the final details, the ring on her finger catching the lamplight. She asked if I was ready. I told her I had been ready since the moment Victoria decided that something belonging to my wife should belong to her instead. The day before the HOA meeting, Victoria sent me an unexpected text message. She said she had been thinking about our situation and believed we could reach a mutually beneficial resolution. She proposed meeting for coffee at a cafe in the shopping center near the neighborhood entrance, just the 2 of us, to discuss options before things became unnecessarily complicated at the public meeting. The message was written in a tone of forced reasonableness, the kind of language people use when they sense control slipping away but refuse to acknowledge it. I showed the message to Hannah and asked what she thought. She said Victoria was scared, that someone must have told her about the witnesses gathering against her. Gloria had mentioned seeing Brenda Collins at the mailboxes that morning, looking rattled after a phone call. Word traveled fast in Meadowbrook Heights. even when people tried to keep secrets. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and selected a table near the window where the afternoon light was strong and the ambient noise was low. I ordered coffee and positioned my phone on the table with the screen facing down, the recording application running silently beneath the dark display. Texas was a one-party consent state for recordings, which meant I needed only my own permission to document our conversation. Victoria arrived exactly on time, dressed in clothes that suggested casual confidence, her jewelry expensive but understated, her smile carrying the warmth of someone who believed she was about to negotiate from a position of strength. She sat across from me and ordered tea, making small talk about the weather and the neighborhood landscaping until the server departed. Then her tone shifted. She leaned forward slightly and said she understood that I was frustrated, that the violations and fines had created tension that neither of us wanted. She said she was prepared to make everything go away, every accusation, every penalty, every threat of a lien, if I would simply agree to one small gesture of goodwill. I asked what gesture she had in mind. Victoria's smile widened, and for a moment, I saw something behind it that looked almost hungry. She said that Hannah's ring had become a symbol of conflict in the community, that its presence was a constant reminder of the discord between our families. She said that if Hannah agreed to donate the ring to the HOA's charitable foundation, she would personally ensure that we were never troubled by violations again. She said this was not about the ring's value, but about healing divisions and moving forward together. I let silence fill the space between us for several seconds before responding. I asked Victoria to clarify what she was proposing. I asked if she was saying that the violations against our property, which she had personally authorized, would disappear if my wife surrendered a piece of jewelry worth $15,000. Victoria's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. She said I was oversimplifying, that this was about community harmony, that she was trying to help us. I asked if she was aware that conditioning the dismissal of HOA violations on the transfer of personal property could be considered extortion under Texas law. Victoria's face went still. The warmth drained from her expression, replaced by something colder and more calculating. She said I was being dramatic, that she was merely suggesting a path forward, that I should be grateful she was willing to negotiate at all. I told her I had one question. I asked if this offer was final, if she was confirming that the violations would remain unless Hannah agreed to the donation. Victoria hesitated, her eyes searching my face for something she could not seem to find. Then she straightened in her chair with the posture of someone who had never been successfully challenged. She said that she did not make offers twice, that people in this community understood how things worked, and that if I needed her to spell it out more clearly, then perhaps I was not as intelligent as I appeared. The contempt in her voice was unmistakable. She added that she had been running Meadowbrook Heights for 6 years and that everyone who had tried to oppose her had eventually learned that cooperation was easier than resistance. I thanked her for her clarity. I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and told her that her statement had been documented. Victoria's face went pale. She asked what I meant. I told her she would find out tomorrow evening at the meeting. I left the cafe without looking back. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding with something that felt like vindication, finally within reach. I forwarded the recording to James Holloway and Detective Amanda Reyes that evening, along with a summary of Victoria's statements. James responded the next morning, confirming that Victoria's implicit connection between dropping violations and receiving the ring likely met the legal threshold for coercion. Amanda called me later that afternoon, saying the recording strengthened the case significantly and that she had received approval from the district attorney's office to have officers present at the meeting. The arrest would happen after Victoria had the opportunity to respond to the allegations publicly, ensuring both proper procedure and community accountability. That evening, Hannah came downstairs and found me at the dining table, organizing the final materials for the presentation. She asked if it was really going to be over soon. I told her that tomorrow evening, Victoria Evans would face the community she had terrorized and the consequences she had earned. Hannah sat beside me and placed her hand over mine. The ring caught the lamplight and scattered it across the table like a promise. She said she was proud of me for not giving up, for not letting someone like Victoria win through intimidation and lies. I told her that I had learned something important over the past month. I told her that bullies only have power when their victims stay silent, and that tomorrow, the silence was going to end. The community clubhouse filled quickly on Monday evening, more than 80 residents drawn by whispers that something significant was going to happen at this year's annual meeting. Victoria Evans sat at the front table, flanked by Brenda Collins and two board members who rarely spoke but always voted in her favor. I sat in the third row with Hannah on my left and James Holloway on my right. The witnesses I had gathered were positioned throughout the room, waiting for their moments. The air felt heavy with anticipation, though most people did not yet understand what they were anticipating. Victoria called the meeting to order at precisely 7 o'clock, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. She moved through the standard agenda items with brisk efficiency, financial reports and maintenance updates, and committee appointments that no one questioned or challenged. When she reached the section labeled Resident Concerns, she glanced in my direction with a smile that suggested she was about to enjoy publicly dismissing whatever complaint I intended to raise. She announced that Mr. Frostegray had requested time to address the community and invited me to approach the front of the room. I stood, picked up the folder I had prepared, and walked to the podium that had been set up beside the board table. Hannah squeezed my hand as I passed. I did not look at Victoria. I looked at the community I was about to wake up in. I began by introducing myself and explaining that my wife and I had moved to Meadowbrook Heights 8 months ago, hoping to find a welcoming community where we could build our lives. I said that instead, we had encountered something very different. I held up the first violation notice and read the accusation aloud, then displayed the security camera footage showing the trash bins stored properly within the required time frame. I held up the second violation notice and showed the photographs of our lawn measuring 3.8 inches, well under the 4-inch limit specified in the CC&Rs. I quoted Section 7.3, which required photographic evidence for all violations. Neither notice had included photographs. I quoted Section 9.2, which required board votes before fines could be imposed. I displayed the board minutes showing no discussion or vote regarding our violations. The room had grown very quiet. Several residents exchanged glances that suggested they had long suspected something was wrong, but had never seen proof laid out so clearly. I told the community that these fabricated violations were not random bureaucratic errors. I said they were part of a deliberate campaign to pressure my family into surrendering something that belonged to us. I played the recording from the HOA office, Victoria's voice filling the room as she explained that the violations could disappear if Hannah donated her anniversary ring to the community. The silence that followed was absolute. Then I played the recording from the cafe, where Victoria confirmed that cooperation meant giving up the ring and that everyone who opposed her eventually learned that resistance was futile. Someone in the back of the room gasped. Victoria's face had gone from composed to rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Brenda Collins shifted in her seat, her eyes darting toward the exit. I asked Mr. Keating if he would be willing to share his experience. The retired accountant stood slowly, his voice steady as he described how Victoria had admired his father's vintage Rolex at a community event 4 years ago. He described the violations that followed, the pressure that mounted, the moment he finally surrendered the watch simply to make the harassment stop. He said he had regretted that decision every day since, and that he was grateful someone was finally exposing what Victoria had been doing. A woman 3 rows back stood without being asked, and said that Victoria had pressured her mother into donating a pearl necklace before the family eventually sold their home. Another resident described receiving unexplained fines after declining to contribute to a charity Victoria personally managed. The confessions came easier once the first ones landed, years of silence breaking open in a room that finally felt safe enough for truth. Tommy Reed stepped forward from his position against the wall. The room turned to watch as he walked to the front, still wearing his security uniform, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He said that Victoria had instructed him to monitor the Gray family specifically, to document any potential violations, even if he had to interpret the rules creatively. He said she had asked him to delete security footage of her approaching their home and trying their doors, footage he had secretly preserved because something about the request felt wrong. He apologized to me directly, saying he should have spoken up sooner but had been afraid of losing his job. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria rose from her chair, her face flushed red, her voice cutting through the noise as she demanded order. She said this was a coordinated attack, that I had manipulated vulnerable people into making false accusations. that everything I had presented was taken out of context or fabricated entirely. She pointed at me and called me a troublemaker who had come into the community and turned neighbors against each other. She said that she had dedicated 6 years to making Meadowbrook Heights a better place and that she would not be destroyed by lies. Her voice rose higher as she spoke, control slipping away with each sentence. She said that people like Hannah did not understand how to carry themselves in a community like this, that a woman of her background had no business wearing something so obviously above her station, that someone with actual refinement would have known the ring was inappropriate from the beginning. The room went completely silent. Victoria seemed to realize what she had said only after the words hung in the air. Her mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Brenda Collins had already risen and was walking toward the exit without looking back. James Holloway stood and addressed the room in his measured attorney's voice. He explained that under Article 7 of the HOA bylaws, any board member could be removed by a vote of no confidence supported by a majority of residents present at an official meeting. He asked if anyone wished to make such a motion. Gloria Mendez raised her hand and said she moved for an immediate vote of no confidence in Victoria Evans as president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. A man near the front seconded the motion. James asked for a show of hands in favor. Arms rose throughout the room, a forest of raised palms that took nearly a minute to count. 74 in favor, 2 opposed. The motion carried. Victoria Evans was removed from the board, effective immediately. Victoria stood frozen behind the table, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked almost like fear. Before she could speak, the side door of the clubhouse opened. Detective Amanda Reyes entered, followed by 2 uniformed deputies. I had texted her when the vote concluded, as we had arranged. Amanda approached the front of the room and addressed Victoria directly. She said that Victoria Evans was being detained for questioning regarding allegations of extortion, criminal trespass, and harassment. She said Victoria had the right to remain silent and should come with her to discuss the matter further. Victoria looked at the deputies, then at the room full of neighbors who had just voted to remove her, then at me standing beside the podium with the evidence that had ended her reign. She walked toward the door without speaking, her shoulders rigid, her expensive shoes clicking against the floor in a rhythm that no longer sounded like counting. It sounded like ending. The criminal proceedings concluded 3 months after the community meeting. Victoria Evans accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial, her attorney advising that the recordings and witness testimonies made conviction nearly certain. The judge sentenced her to 1 year of probation for extortion and 6 months for criminal trespass, the terms running concurrently. She was ordered to pay $10,000 in fines and restitution, divided among the families who had provided statements documenting her years of harassment. The court also imposed a 10-year ban on holding any position in a homeowners association or nonprofit organization in the state of Texas. Victoria stood motionless as the sentence was read, her face carrying the hollow expression of someone who had finally run out of angles to play. The consequences cascaded faster than anyone anticipated. Brenda Collins resigned from the HOA board within a week of the meeting, perhaps sensing that her role as Victoria's enforcer would not survive scrutiny. She put her house on the market and moved to a suburb on the other side of Dallas, disappearing from Meadowbrook Heights as quietly as she had once carried out Victoria's orders. Derek Evans filed for divorce 2 weeks after his wife's arrest. The house where Victoria had lived for 15 years sold at a loss, the proceeds consumed by legal fees and restitution payments. Gloria told me that Victoria had moved into a small apartment complex near the highway. Her Meadowbrook Heights address traded for an existence far removed from the life she had once flaunted. The community moved quickly to prevent anything like this from happening again. With Victoria removed and Brenda gone, the remaining board members seemed relieved to have direction rather than resistant to change. Gloria Mendez was elected interim president by unanimous vote at an emergency session held 2 weeks after the annual meeting. The new board implemented reforms within the first month, requiring photographic evidence for all violation notices, mandatory board votes before any fines could be imposed, and term limits preventing any president from serving more than 2 consecutive 2-year terms. Mr. Keating told me at a neighborhood barbecue that he felt lighter than he had in years, that watching Victoria face consequences had given him closure. He had stopped believing was possible. Tommy Reed kept his job. The new board recognized that he had been placed in an impossible position and had ultimately chosen to do the right thing. He stopped me in the street one afternoon to thank me for not holding his earlier compliance against him. I told him that courage sometimes arrived late, but what mattered was that it arrived at all. Hannah and I sat on our back porch the evening after the sentencing, watching the sunset behind the houses at the edge of the neighborhood. The ring caught the fading light and scattered it across the wooden planks like small stars being born. Hannah leaned her head against my shoulder and said she was proud of what we had done, not just for ourselves, but for the neighbors who had suffered in silence before we arrived. I told her that the ring had never really been about the diamond. It was about the right to keep what belonged to us. A local news station had covered the sentencing, running a short segment about the HOA president who had used her position to pressure residents into surrendering valuables. A month later, I received an email from a stranger in another suburb who had seen the story. Her situation sounded familiar, a pattern of manufactured violations following her refusal to donate an antique brooch to a community auction. I wrote back with a detailed list of steps. The same process I had followed, the same patience I had learned was necessary. I told her to document everything. I told her that bullies only won when good people gave up. I hit send and looked out the window at the neighborhood that finally felt like home. The petition had already reshaped Meadowbrook Heights. But the final blow came the night Victoria attempted to reclaim control. She called an emergency clarification meeting, expecting the board to rally around her like they always had. Instead, she walked into the clubhouse and found more than 50 residents waiting, arms folded, faces steady, petition copies in their hands. Hannah and I sat near the front, the diamond ring catching the fluorescent light like a quiet challenge. Victoria took her seat with forced composure, flipping open a binder she clearly believed would intimidate the room. But when she began speaking, dismissing the petition as gossip, calling residents confused, hinting that anyone supporting it would face increased scrutiny, the shift was immediate. Murmurs rose, chairs scraped. People who had stayed silent for years finally stood up. Mr. Keating was the first to speak, his voice steady as he described the vintage watch Victoria had pressured him into surrendering. Then the Thompsons stepped forward, recounting the endless fines that had driven them from their home. One by one, residents spoke, some shaking with anger, others with relief as they described trespasses, threats, and violations that had never existed. Victoria's composure crumbled line by line, until she was gripping the edge of the podium with whitening knuckles. When she tried to interrupt, Gloria raised her hand and recited Section 7.5 of the governing documents, reminding the room that residents had the right to speak without interference. The atmosphere shifted again, not with anger, but with something colder, collective conviction. Victoria looked out at the faces she once controlled, and finally realized her power had evaporated. The board vote happened quickly. A motion for immediate removal, a second, hands raised across the room in silent, undeniable unity. Victoria Evans was stripped of her title in less than 5 minutes. She tried to argue, but her voice barely rose above the sound of her own unraveling. Hannah took my hand as a new board member stepped forward to announce that all pending violations, including ours, were suspended pending review. The room exhaled as if someone had finally opened a window in a house long sealed shut. Victoria gathered her things and hurried, jerky motions, her eyes avoiding every face in the room. For the first time since we moved here, her presence felt small, diminished, powerless. She left the clubhouse without a word, heels clicking across the pavement with none of their old confidence. Several cars started as neighbors quietly made sure she went straight home. Hannah and I walked back through a neighborhood that felt different, lighter, freer, reclaimed. She lifted her hand, letting the ring rest in the glow of the street lamps, and smiled in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. I told her the truth that victory doesn't always come from fighting harder. Sometimes it comes from helping others remember they never had to fight alone. The petition, the witnesses, the voices they had done what fear once made impossible. Meadowbrook Heights belonged to its residents again. And as we stepped through our front door, Hannah slipped her hand into mine and said the words that closed the chapter perfectly. She never wanted the ring, she whispered. She wanted control. And tonight, she lost both.